So what I'd like to do is share with you a few ideas about spatial literacy and its relationship to experience and education. And I'd like to start with a fairly simple idea, which is we don't really experience things. We experience relationships. All experience can be understood as relational, as in conversation. So, as an example, I'm speaking right now, and we're listening to my voice. And there are images behind me, and there are chairs holding you, and there are lights coming at me, and there are columns that are holding open this space. Now, our experience is commingling all of them. In fact, our experience emerges in the conversation between all of these. And space is a participant in that conversation. And in fact, it has a spatial literacy in its participation. And that literacy can be developed into a spatial literature. And so what I'd like to do is share with you a few spatial stories. And I wanted to start with these images. They are made by Michael Benson. He's a dear friend, and he's a photographer and a filmmaker. And he works with satellites and with raw spacecraft image data, and he processes it, and he assembles it, and he creates these astounding images of our solar system and of deep space, the kind of thing you can't even believe exists. This is a moon off Jupiter. And another moon off Jupiter. A few years ago, we were really lucky to have Michael here at the school, and he was in one of my classes, and he was sharing some of these astounding images. And we were looking at an image of deep space. And one of the students asked, "Oh, well, what satellite was that taken from?" And Michael said, "Well, it was actually shot in Hawaii. And it was by an astronomer named W.G. Wang. And he went on to describe this incredible tracking equipment, it was sort of 6 hours a night for 28 nights, following the same spot in the sky, and it could capture the light, and you could create this image." And the student said, "But don't you have to be in outer space to see that?" And Michael said, "Where do you think we are?" And I love that story because it's one of those moments where you sense a transformation, meaning we're still here, but here is slightly different after you hear that. The other day, I was up in Providence, and I had to get back to New York, and I was late for the train. So I'm running towards the train station, and I'm running as fast as I can. I know I'm late. I get into the station. I run across the floor. There's long steps. I'm running down the steps as fast as I can, trying not to fall, but trying to make it. Run out onto the platform, and just as I get there, the train had pulled out. And in that moment, I woke up on the train. It had been a dream, and a dream I was having on the train. So I was inside and outside the train at the same time. Okay. When I was about 10 years old, I was in a truck, in a tractor trailer. Actually, I was building that tractor trailer. My family has built trucks and tractor trailers since they were wagons and sleighs in the 1890s. And I was incredibly lucky to grow up in this community of craft. And craft is actually a culture, and it's a culture of paying attention. It's a culture of listening, and it's a culture of care. So in our community, we would put the oldest with the youngest. So when I was very little, I worked with my grandfather, and by the time I was about 10 or 12, I was working with a wonderful man named Bear. And one day, Bear and I were assembling a truck. And what we were doing was fairly specific. You see, the truck has a skin, which is the sheets of metal, and it has these structures. And to attach the skin to the structures, you have to drill an enormous amount of holes through both of them. And then each one of those holes you have to fill with a rivet. You've seen this many times. All those little dots on the outside of a truck, those are rivets. That's a little piece of metal. And what happens is you have to shoot the piece of metal through the outside of the truck, and it has to go in, and it has to squish out and squeeze the skin to the structure. Now, when I was a kid, that was a two-person job. The way that was done is that there was a person on the inside who had a rather significant piece of iron that you would hold against the hole. So when the rivet came through, it would splay out and squish. So, because I was a kid, Bear made me a piece of metal that was, sort of shaped like a gun. It had a flat front, and I would get in there and hold it. Now, the interesting part is that since a truck is very deep and there's a lot of rivets, it's not really realistic that you're going to run out to the edge of the truck every time and say, okay, I'm ready for the next. That's not going to work. You have to stay there, and you have to develop a form of communication through the wall, right, in order to keep going. In some way, it's kind of simple. You start low, 3 taps, we're going to start, first one goes through. But the reality is, it's all about the rhythm. It's about knowing how to keep moving so that I could catch each one of those rivets. And sometimes we would be communicating like that for 2 or 3 hours without actually, going and seeing each other. We were speaking through the wall. And I remember Bear said to me, you have to know where I'm heading so that I know you're going to be there when I get there. Right? Now that's spatial literacy. Okay, so when my son Rostam was about 4 and my daughter Sarah was about 6, I would bring them to school every day. And I would do this. I had a scooter, sort of like a kid's scooter, but adult size, had a motor. And we had arranged this sort of game where I would chase them or race them down the sidewalk. And the sort of rules were, if either of them got there first, they won. So after a few days of doing this, I noticed that Rostam started to block me. So I would go to the right, and he would block to the right. And I would go to the left, and he would block to the left. And, bobbing and weaving, whichever way I went, I couldn't get past him. Now, the astounding thing is that he did this never looking back. He did this the whole time, running as fast as he could, looking forward, never moving left. And I couldn't understand how he did it. So one day I said to him, how do you do that? And he said, oh, that's easy, Dad. All I have to do is run into your shadow, and you can't get past me. I mean, it's an incredible understanding of navigating the spatial situation that we're in. I didn't even see those shadows till he said it. Okay, I got to tell you a story about Philo Farnsworth. Philo Farnsworth is the person who invented the television. He was a mathematical genius, and he was also a farmer. See, one of the great challenges in the early days of trying to make the television is that the electrical signal necessary in order to reconstitute an image through the tube and in the screen was so large that it would basically explode, blow up whatever tube they could come up with or whatever way of capturing it. Now, Philo had spent his life tilling the fields, cutting these lines to the end of one row and back again. And at the age of 15 or 16, he had the epiphany, the mathematical and the electrical epiphany, that the signal could be broken up into smaller pieces and that they could draw the image back and forth across the screen. And that's how the television has worked, all the way up until the flat screen inventions. Television tubes have always worked that way. He called it the image dissector. Now, a few years after that, Joseph Woodland, who invented the barcode, told the story that he was working like crazy to try to figure out how to get some kind of a visual version of Morse code. And he couldn't do it. And he basically gave up. And he went to the beach in Florida. And he sat there and he just pulled his fingers across the sand and he looked at those lines and he realized he had done it. There was a visual Morse code. So each of these stories is speaking of the communication that's going on between us and our spaces. Right? Each of these kind of aha moments are emerging in a conversation that is in direct communication with the spatial situation that we find ourselves in. And I believe that looking carefully at spatial literacy can have a great impact on our spaces of education and how we ask our questions in relation to the spatial literacy that we are in. So a few years ago, I founded an organization with a group of wonderful people from all over the world called, the organization is called Arts, Letters, and Numbers. And it has the specific mission of broadening the spectrum of spatial situations that people can ask their questions in and develop new ways of knowing. And some of those spatial situations have to do with individuals and what I would call emotive precision, and some of them with groups of people and the kind of connective tissues that can be developed between groups of people. So I want to show you a project that we did in Denmark, in Aarhus, in 2012. It was called the Aarhus Arc. And it was a film screen drawing board for about 200 people. And it started with a very beautiful proposition that the wonderful philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas made, which was that the highest state, the highest sense of the human condition can be found in the space between two faces looking at each other in silence. And so we decided to try to build a project out of that proposition. And we started by building this big curved wall, and we skinned it with paper. And then each of the participants were asked to go out into the town of Aarhus and to find a place that had some kind of emotional content for them, some memory, some kind of an emotional experience that they had had, and to make a drawing of it, a meter by a meter, and bring it back. And you can see them on the outside walls of the theater we were in. And then we formed teams, partnerships of two. And if you think about it, the basic idea was that, look, if I'm here and there's this huge wall between us, right, and my emotional memory is captured and it's on the outside of that wall, I can't see it. I don't have any access to it, but my partner does, the other does. And the project was for that person to reenact my drawing on the outside of the wall and to try to whisper it through the wall to me. Okay? So that creates an emotional interdependence and an empathy. And you can probably recognize Bear in the truck and maybe Rostam's shadows. The idea was that if we could together invent a form of communication through this opacity, right, then we would develop a way that I could have access to my origin through you. And that led to all kinds of inventions of forms of communication. Here it's almost, in fact, an embodied inhabitation of the Levinas proposition about two faces. I mean, inventions. These drawing instruments were in fact being moved by the people on the other side of the wall. That's how they whispered the drawing through the wall. And then at a certain point we introduced live feed film. So around the entire outside of the arc we placed a series of film cameras, and you can see there a bank of projectors, and each one of those cameras was linked to one of those projectors. And then they were operating in live time. And what that created was the fact that these two people who were in communication with each other were now, in fact, experiencing the person in lifetime. This is a still photograph, but I want to show you a couple of films from that. They're on opposite sides of the wall, and they're in direct communication.
Yes. Her and her shadow.
Here's a little bit of a close-up. You can see you get to this very kind of special place. Now here, because eventually when you're inside of this spatial situation and it's spatial literacy and literature, you begin to inhabit it. And here you can see these two guys are basically playing with it. He's going to throw that cup through the hole. So he threw it through the image of the hole and it came out the hole. And now this last one I want to show you, for me, it's a kind of eclipse in that Aarhus arc, and it has to do with this idea of an emotive precision, right? That the emotional experience of inhabiting the question creates a kind of precision. Just stunning. So, where do you think we are? Well, we're here, and we're here at the same time. When Abraham Lincoln was here in 1860, there were 1.2 billion people on the planet. And today there are 7.5 billion people on the planet. And I want to end with the last story. When my daughter, Sav, was about 6, I was bringing her to school on the same scooter, but it was just her, so she was actually riding on the front of it, driving to school, having our conversations. And at some point she said, "What's the highest number that you can count to?" And I thought about it a little bit, and I said, well, let's think about it another way. What would possibly slow down numbers or stop them? A couple days later, we're driving, and she says, "I think I have an idea what would stop the numbers." And I said, "What?" And she said, "Death." You know, pull over. Hold on a second. Okay, that's nice. So tell me, why'd you say that? And she said, "Because we're the ones doing the counting. And so when we end, the counting ends. And that's the highest number we can count to." And then she said, "But do you know what? Since we're all born at different times and we all die at different times, the counting actually never stops. Do you know what that's called? It's called infinity. It's all of us together."